Chapter 22 The Pool of Serpents. Amon left his two friends far behind as he tore across the viaduct, then across the upper city and down toward the far city wall. He burst through the front door of his house, almost taking off its hinges. "Mother!" he shouted. Tabitha jumped and the bowl in her hands crashed to the floor. "Amon!" she scolded. "You frightened me!" Amon rushed to his mother's side. "Forgive me, mother, but I must ask you something." Tabitha looked down at her feet. "My bread!" she cried. Amon glanced at the bread dough on the floor mixed with broken bits of pottery, but the sight didn't even take root in his mind. "I must ask you something," Amon said again. Tabitha looked up at her son to scold him again, but then saw the excitement in his eyes and stopped herself. She sighed, turned, and pulled the rope hanging from the ceiling. Water gushed from the pipe in the wall, and she washed bread dough from her hands as she said, "Very well, what is this thing you must ask?" "Come, sit," Amon said, moving over to the table. Tabitha dried her hands, then sat across from her son. Amon leaned over the table, getting close to Tabitha. In a low and serious voice he said, "Mother, I must know the truth of a thing." Tabitha nodded, a frown of curiosity creasing her forehead. "I know," Amon continued slowly, "I know that father has told many stories that are not, stories that he thinks in his head are true but cannot be, stories of angels and such." Tabitha's frown turned from curiosity to disgust, and she interrupted her son. "Every story your father has ever told is true, Amon." Amon sighed. "Mother, I am no longer a child. You do not need to protect me from father's madness." "Amon!" Tabitha snapped. "Your father is not—" She dismissed the idea with a wave of her hand. "What is this thing you must ask?" Amon lowered his voice again. "I must ask about one particular story," he said. "The story about how his father was saved by your father." Tabitha nodded. "Yes, that is most certainly true." "Even the part about Grandpa Eliakim being a Roman citizen?" Instead of answering her son directly, Tabitha told the story in its whole. "Many years ago," she began, "your grandfather, my father, saved Caesar Augustus himself from the teeth of a terrible sandstorm in the desert. In return, Caesar gave your grandfather a parchment making him a citizen of Rome, with all the rights such an honor holds. He never told anyone until one day—" Tabitha's voice drifted off. "One day what?" Amon begged. Tabitha closed her eyes, remembering the events as she told of them. "Until one day, when your father's father was accused by a Roman tax collector of cheating on his taxes. My father intervened, and when the Roman found out Grandfather Eliakim was a citizen of Rome, he let Grandfather Asa go free." Amon thought for a long moment, then said, "And this story is true?" Tabitha sighed. "Yes, my son, it is most assuredly true." A grin wider than the Kidron Valley crossed Amon's face. "Then father shall go free," he said. Tabitha shook her head. "No, Amon, it cannot be." "But, mother," Amon cried, "you do not understand." He half stood, leaned across the table, took his mother by the shoulders, and looked straight into her eyes. "If your father was a citizen of Rome, then you are a citizen of Rome. It is how their law works. Gamaliel himself told me this thing. So all you have to do is go to Pontius Pilate and prove your citizenship. Then he will surely free father." Amon jumped up from the table and started pacing. He laughed and clapped his hands together as he realized he had just saved his father's life. "Amon," Tabitha said, but her son ignored her. "Amon!" she shouted louder, but still her son danced around the room. "Amon!" Finally, Amon stopped and looked at his mother, a grin still covering his face. "The Roman tax collector was humiliated by your grandfather. He swore he would get his revenge on him and all his family." Amon's smile faded only slightly. "So? What has that to do with father? Surely this tax collector is long ago dead." Tabitha shook her head. No, he is not. His name is written in my memory as clearly as yours, she said, and he is still very much alive. Curious now, Amon's smile faded altogether. What is his name? He asked. Who is he? Tabitha took a deep breath before spitting out the name. Pilate, she said. His name is Pontius Pilate. Amon gasped as if his mother had slapped him. His knees were suddenly weak and he staggered forward and slumped down on the bench. His skull was full of hornets and he could neither see nor think for several moments. Finally he looked at his mother, his mouth moving like a fish out of water. Pilate? He repeated, shaking his head as if that could make it not so. So you see, Tabitha said, sitting across the table from her son, if I were to go to Pilate and claim citizenship, he would kill your father himself just to revenge the humiliation your grandfathers caused him. Romans do not forget. Amon looked up at his mother, and at that moment Benjamin and Tamar burst through the door, panting hard. So, what? Tamar wheezed at Amon. What's this idea that's going to save your father? Tabitha quickly explained to the two friends. Overwhelmed with grief, Amon flew out the front door of the house and ran to his right. His sandaled feet made clopping sounds in the dust as he fled down the street toward the city wall with Tamar and Benjamin right behind. When he reached the gate of the Essenes, Amon didn't even slow down to wish the beggars well as he usually did. He ran out of the gate, anger and frustration driving him to the edge of the cliff that ran along that side of the city. He turned to his right again toward the west and kept running until he passed the Pool of Serpents, a name he never did understand since he had never once seen a serpent there. Just past the pool was a stand of olive trees, and it was here he finally ran out of breath. Amon scooped up a dead branch from the ground, as if he were a prince and the trees were all thieves. He started slashing at the trunks of the olive trees, striking first one, then another. He bashed at the trees with all his strength and screamed too angry to even think an angry thought. Tamar and Benjamin skidded to a stop and watched their friend, scared for him. Amon! Tamar shouted, but her friend didn't respond. Amon! She yelled again. This time Amon responded, but not to Tamar. He smashed his stick into one particular tree over and over as if it were his worst enemy, shouting over and over, I hate Caiaphas! I hate Caiaphas! Benjamin looked around, nervous that someone might hear Amon's blasphemy. I hate all priests, Amon continued, his swing slowing down as his energy slipped away. I hate everyone, he said finally, and slumped to the ground in tears. Tamar rushed to Amon's side, sat next to him, and pulled him close. It is not bad that you are angry at injustice, she whispered in his ear after several minutes. Even Jesus was angry at the thieves in the temple, but you must only hate the evil which men do, not the men who do it. Jesus said that hatred stirs up dissension, but love covers all wrongs. Amon raised his head and through his tears spat out, Jesus didn't say that. It is written in the Torah. Perhaps so, Tamar said quietly, forgiving Amon's angry voice, but that does not mean it is not true. Of course it's true, Amon barked again. It is in the Torah, so it must be true. Tamar sighed. Then it does not make sense that your hatred does it not make sense that your hatred can only lead to evil? Amon jumped to his feet and started pacing around the olive trees as Benjamin looked on, frightened at his friend's anger. It is not hatred, Amon spat out. It is just frustration. But you just said, I know what I said, but it is not what I meant. Amon's pacing slowed as his thinking started to clear. I did not mean that I truly hate the high priest, he continued. I was just saying that I was angry with him, that's all. I'm just angry because he is the reason my father is going to die. Tamar said nothing, and finally Amon's anger ebbed, and he sat next to the girl who was his friend. I just do not know what to do, he said softly. I have tried everything I can think of to save my father. There was a long silence during which Benjamin sat down at the base of an olive tree some distance away. Amon, Tamar said, you have indeed tried many ways to save your father. You have investigated the crime of which he is accused, proven him innocent of the charges, petitioned the Roman governor. You have even thought of using your mother's status as a Roman citizen. You have tried everything there is to try, Tamar continued, except one. Amon looked at his friend, his face smudged where his tears had mixed with the dust. And what is that? He asked. What have I not tried? Tamar hesitated a moment, then said softly, Jesus. You haven't tried asking Jesus for help. Amon turned away in disgust. I thought you might have something of use to suggest, he said. I do, Tamar insisted. Listen to me. Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Son of God himself. He can help you. Amon jumped up and strode over to the pool. On any other day the cool waters would have invited him in for a swim, but now the heat of his anger consumed his mind. Jesus of Nazareth, he shouted, his back still to Tamar. Matthias the Skinner, Joel the Zarephath, Erastus the Hermit. Amon spun around and shouted at his friend. How many more do you want me to name? 10, 20, 100? They're everywhere, Tamar. False messiahs, every one. Amon went back to where Tamar was sitting and encircled her as he preached. This one says he will heal the sick. That one says he knows the future. And what do they want in return? Why, a helping of your money, that's all. And what do the people get from it? Amon stopped in front of Tamar and dropped to his knees, staring her straight in the eye. Nothing, he shouted. That's what. They get nothing, because there is no such thing as a Messiah. There is no Son of God. They're just sick or mad or thieves, every single one of them, including this Jesus of yours. So don't tell me he will help me. Tamar sat staring at the ground as Amon fell back, panting from his tirade. He thought he should feel like he'd won a great victory, that his words had been strong enough to prove his point. Instead, he felt only emptiness inside. I know that most of what you say is true, Tamar said quietly, her eyes still fixed on the dirt. I know there are many who claim to be the Messiah, but who could not be, since they seek only profit and honor for themselves. She looked up at Amon then and continued in a pleading voice. But Jesus is different. He never asked for anything from anybody. He speaks of being a servant, of helping others instead of self, of loving even one's enemies. Can't you see, Amon? He really is the Messiah. How else could he raise people from the dead and heal the ones who are sick? Amon shook his head as if Tamar were a silly child. Tricks and lies, he said. That is all. Just tricks and lies. My father does not think so, Tamar said. Your father has... Amon caught himself before he finished the sentence. My father has what? Nothing. I meant nothing. My father is a wise and knowing man, Tamar said defensively. Amon tried his best to keep the words inside his chest, but they quickly overpowered him and forced their way out of his mouth. Your father has wasted 3 years following a madman. Tamar gasped as if she'd been slapped. My father has given his life to the Messiah. And what kind of Messiah would ask a man to abandon his only daughter? Amon shouted, anger swelling in his heart once again. He did not abandon me. He took me with him everywhere he went until it became too dangerous. Dragging you from town to town with no home and no mother? Why didn't he remarry after your mother died, so you would have a woman to teach you? Both of them scrambled to their feet now, facing off like dogs in an alley fight. My mother died when I was born, and my father has taken care of me ever since. He is a perfect father and a perfect mother. Until some false Messiah comes along and hexes him. He was called by Jesus to be a disciple, Tamar shouted. He is a man of honor and dedication. He is a man of foolishness. How dare you call my father a fool? He is a good and decent man who cares more for others than for himself." Amon reared back, his words flying like the strike of a snake. "Your father is crazier than mine," he roared. For a moment the only sound to be heard was the birds in the trees, but then Amon finished his accusation. "And that," he said with the bitterness of bitter herbs, "is a mighty task indeed." Tears streamed down Tamar's face, and she looked as if her own brother had just betrayed her. She stared at Amon for a moment, then stopped off past the pool of serpents and back to the city. Amon turned his back on Jerusalem and headed up the hill. As he passed the trunk of a particularly large olive tree with Benjamin hiding in its shadow, his eyes wide as wagon wheels, Amon stopped. Benjamin gulped, then said, "I think Tamar is angry with you." Amon stared at his friend for a moment, then in a flat voice said, "Tell my mother I will sleep in the hills tonight. She need not worry about me." Benjamin nodded dumbly with his mouth hanging open, and Amon turned and climbed the hill.